This is the Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to John. Jesus said to his disciples, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. He removes every branch in me that bears no fruit. Every branch that bears fruit, he prunes to make it bear more fruit. You have already been cleansed by the word that I have spoken to you. Abide in me, as I abide in you. Just as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself, unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who abide in me and I in them bear much fruit, because apart from me you can do nothing. Whoever does not abide in me is thrown away like a branch and withers. Such branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you abide in me, though, and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish. It will be done for you. My Father is glorified by this, that you bear much fruit and become my disciples." This is the gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Please be seated. So good to be here again. So good to see all the faces I've come to love. And for those of you I haven't seen before, I want to welcome you and hope that I'll see you again. This has kind of become a second home, and I want to let some of you know, I don't know if everybody knows how generous Grace Church has been to my parish in Leadville, Colorado. And it would be impossible for me to tell you everything. There's so much connection that is building and surprises for us. Not too long ago, I was asked by some people at Grace Church to step outside for a moment. I can't remember why. Do you remember why? Was it a Saturday night? When you brought the dishes and the cups and things. So I'm just kind of remembering that I had gotten a call, we'd like to meet with you. Well, when you hear that in general life, it's like, oh, what did I do? And and so I already heard that. And then when lovely friends from Grace Church, well, I know it's probably good news, and yet still culture leaves you like, oh gosh, what have I done? And they said, well, we'd like you to step outside. Okay. So I stepped outside, and there's a bunch of boxes, and they began to parade them inside, and they were new dishes and mugs and salad plates and a variety of place settings for the free community meals that we serve. Now I don't know if we got a picture before and after, but we had these dishes from the thrift store that we kept replacing, and the stack of them kind of looked like this, and it always looked like it was about to fall. And of course, then we'd run down to the thrift store and get some more, but they never kind of stack just right. And we had dreamed of Corral dishes, but they're expensive. So that's just one story. Another story is you sent a check, and I can't remember whether this was, I'm kind of embarrassed, I should know these things, but whether it was the Women's Bible Study or Grace Church as a whole, I'm not sure that the spirit is the same, it's still Grace, but sent $800 to use however we would like. And so we have already assigned a woman who comes to the meals, who's a seamstress, to make us new pew cushions for all of our pews. And the stories go on and on and on of your generosity. So I want to say thank you for being the kind of church that's awake to what's needed, being the kind of church that says, what do you need? And that's really lovely. So if you don't know that, look around, get to know your neighbors here in the pews, and this is a really beautiful place to be. I had this brilliant, I still do, I have this sermon on the Ethiopian eunuch, and I will give that to you. But I wanted to back up a little bit, because as I had a little bit of a surprise last night, and then as I was going to bed, I looked up a little more to tweak my sermon and found out that the Ethiopian eunuch was likely from South Sudan. And very good chance of that. And so I didn't know that. Earlier that night, I had a visit from a family from South Sudan. So I'd like to tell you about that. And, those are kind of funny moments when you go, oh, this is closer to home than I thought. So several months ago, maybe a year ago, I think it was over a year ago, actually, George is my husband, who's also priest at St. George's, and we were at diocesan convention, and there was a man at our table, a very, very tall, very, very black man, dressed to the T, dressed sharper than sharp. And I have this little thing, I get kind of nervous around people who dress too well, because it just kind of stirs my shame or something. I kind of feel frumpy a lot of the time, and my hair never behaves, and so I didn't go out of my way to introduce myself. I'm embarrassed to say that. I'm not proud of that, but it's this thing. I usually will introduce myself to the person who's not dressed to the T. But George doesn't follow the same rules I do. So he at one of the breaks said, "I'm George, and nice to meet you." And quickly he learned, what was that? And this is my wife. So then at the second break, he came to me and he said, "We have to do something. There is an urgent need." And I didn't know anything about it because I hadn't introduced myself. So George introduced himself to this man named Robert, who has become a dear friend since, and learned that Robert's in South Sudan, and that just recently, within, I think, 3 months of when they talked, her-in-law was killed by a gunman and leaving 2 orphans. Their orphans' names are O'Lear, who's about 6, and Free, who's about 4. And that they are now in a refugee camp in Uganda without either parent. And Robert is just desperate to get them home. Just, I can only imagine if someone you love has died, you'd want to care for their children. And the thing that we learned over time was that the younger boy, whose name is Free, is deaf. And so it's urgent that they stay together. And so that's a long story. We've done some fundraising and we've developed a relationship, and our goal at St. George's is to get them home one way or another, to get those boys here. So I got an email from Robert last week, and he told me some more sad news. There was a second cousin who was watching the boys. They're in Uganda, you understand, because they sought safety from South Sudan. She had to go back to South Sudan for a funeral, and I think all I'll say right now is she was kidnapped and just some horrible things happened to her, and so she is no longer able to care for the boys, and she's in a hospital right now. So I said, "We're here, we love you, please let us know how we can help." And he said something like, "Please just hold us in prayer." And I said, "Well, if you ever want to visit," and this was a week ago, I said, "next Saturday or Sunday." Saturday, we're around all day, Sunday night, church. Well, Saturday, I got a call, we're on our way. And I hadn't heard back, so I didn't know. And so George scrambled to quickly go, because I didn't get the text for an hour. So by the time I knew they were on their way, they were really on their way, maybe an hour away. And we went to Safeway and grabbed some food and set a table quickly with some chicken wings and coleslaw. And she arrived beautiful, in her beautiful Sudanese dress with this large loaf of bread, and kind of had expected the whole community to be there. And that's just culture. That's when we don't read each other's cues. And so the 4 of us sat down and had a lovely conversation about how we're going to get those boys here. We don't know yet how that will happen. So we open up the story this morning, the Ethiopian eunuch, and it's very likely that this is very close to home, to this family that I've come to love. So I want to say some things. First, in case you weren't listening, I'm going to just retell the story of the Ethiopian eunuch. Many of you know it, but it's a really important story. I think it's a story of maybe I would dare say trusting the resurrection of spring, trusting stepping out of something that's not so beautiful, taking the risk of belonging. So we have an angel speaking to Philip and telling Philip to go to a certain place. And Philip responds. As many of the people in the early church did, they had such an aliveness to that subtle voice of Jesus telling them what to do. They just had this way of moving into that life. And he got up immediately and went. And what he encountered very quickly was an Ethiopian eunuch, a court official of the Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, in charge of her entire treasury. He had come to Jerusalem to worship and was returning home, seated in his chariot. He was reading the prophet Isaiah. Now, if you heard what I said about my little quirks, I'm hearing this guy's fancy, right? This guy, he's the court official, the queen. He's in charge of her entire treasury. If I didn't read further, I'd think this guy is probably one of those people I wouldn't go up and introduce myself to, and George would, and would hear the whole story. So in the spirit of George, we will hear the whole story. So an Ethiopian eunuch, let me say a little bit more, and then I'll go tell you that piece if you don't know already. And the Spirit prompted Philip to say, to go up to it, to the chariot, to this person, and say, "Do you understand what you're reading?" And he said, "How could I, if there weren't someone to explain it to me?" And so Philip got in the chariot and sat beside him. Not all that different than what George did. Here's the passage he was reading, and this will make more sense in a moment. "Like a sheep was led to the slaughter, like a lamb silent before its shearer, so he does not open his mouth. In his humiliation, justice was denied him. Who can describe his generation? For his life is taken away from the earth." So in a moment I'll come back to that. It's pretty significant that those are the words he was reading. And the Ethiopian, the eunuch, we'll just call him the eunuch, said, "Do you mind if I ask you, who was he talking about in this passage? Was he speaking about himself? Or was he speaking about somebody else?" And then Philip went on to tell the story of Jesus. And after that, the eunuch says, they come to stop by a body of water, and he says, "What's to prevent me from being baptized?" And so the rest of the story is history. He's baptized. He's one of the first converts, if not the first convert to Christianity among the Gentiles. So that's an important story. What I want to tell you, if you don't already know, about a eunuch. The combination of the word eunuch together with court official indicates a literal eunuch. And so this person would have been excluded from the temple. So this person has a different set of body parts than most of us. And that is either a choice that the eunuch made in his life, or it's something that was done to him. We don't know. But because this person has been castrated or some version of that, he is particularly of interest to the temple court and to the treasury. And the reason is that if you are a eunuch, in the definition that I just gave, then you have no chance of having children. So that's the first thing. So if you're in charge of a lot of money and you're very, very close to the powers that be, overhearing conversations, being in intimate connection to them, it's a risk to the queen, to the treasury, if you have some of your interests of your own, because you might steal, you might use those secrets for your own behalf. So if there's any way that you could have a life, you're probably not going to be the choice. And I'm trying to think of how they worded this. You're not going to be a court official of the Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, in charge of her entire treasure. That's his job description or title. That's not going to be given to somebody who might have reason to steal secrets, to steal money. Also, if you are a eunuch, you cannot enter the military. So if you think this is someone who doesn't have a chance of ever having their own family, and so maybe a second choice if you can't have your own family might be to join the military, which is a kind of a family. But Ethiopian eunuchs were not permitted to join the military, so there wasn't that loyalty either. So in addition to that, there is a scripture, Deuteronomy 23, that says a eunuch is restricted from the temple. And if you ever want to look it up, it says no one who has been castrated may come into the congregation. So any chance of community, any chance of his own family, either through having his own generation or through the military or through the church, all of that's denied him. And so he's a perfect candidate for being in this prestigious position, and yet when you look a little closer, it's not so prestigious. And so he's asking about this passage where it says, where was that again? In his humiliation, we already know he's relating to that. His humiliation, justice was denied him. And I imagine that this person is leaning in, I think I hear my story in this. So you've got Philip translating, and he's saying, wow. And then it says, who can describe his generation? Who can describe his offspring? No one can describe his offspring. So he's still listening. And then it says, his life is taken away from the earth. So immediately, our story, the Christian story, the Judeo-Christian story, is immediately irrelevant. And he wants to know, who is this about? And then Philip goes on to describe Jesus. That this is about Jesus as well as many others. But in this case, it's a reference to Jesus. And the eunuch now feels as though he has a companion. I want to know more. I want to know the community that's built around somebody like me. I think that's just really beautiful. And so the next thing that happens is they come to a body of water. And this is a little sentence that you could miss. The first thing he says is, look, here's the water. Here's water. What's to prevent me from being baptized? That's his first thing. So he has lived a life of being prevented. That's just the norm. So I think after a while, you just ask that question right off because you're expecting to hear, I'm sorry, you can't be in the military. No, you can't be in the temple. No, you can't have children. But you can have this wonderful job, but that's all. And so he's just used to tell me the bad news first. So he's compelled to this wonderful sense of a community that not only is belonging, but the kind of belonging that makes his life relevant. Jesus is not so different than he is. Jesus has no children. He has nowhere to lay his head, and yet he's the center. So I just feel the beauty of that. And he then asks the question, what is to prevent me? And how beautiful it is that Philip doesn't say anything. They just get out and they go down. He walks down to the water with him. He gets in the water with him. How beautiful is that? And then he baptizes him. And tradition has it the eunuch then went on to preach the good news far and wide. Lovely, lovely story. What else do I want to tell you about that? I think what I want to invite us to is the courage that this eunuch had to step out of his life. Sure, it was working. He had a good life. I mean, we could say that. He probably was dressed in fine clothes. I'm going to assume that. He needs to represent the court. And I'm sure they wanted him, if he's representing them, to look good. I think in many ways his life was working. And for how many of us, life's working, but then there's this something that is longing for more. And I would call that the Holy Spirit saying, yes, your life's working, but there is more you could know. There's more you could experience. How courageous for the eunuch to invite Philip into his chariot, to ask the question, to have a conversation, and then to step into this community. I don't know this for sure, so don't quote me on it, but I think joining this community meant he lost his job. I don't think a job where his life was so strictly controlled that he couldn't go into the temple was going to be the kind of job that would allow him to join this new radical community of people who are not necessarily following the status quo. So I don't know that. Maybe he was able to pull it off, but I think he might have been taking more of a risk of resurrection than is immediately clear in this passage. I think that he may have moved and given all to a place of true belonging. And can't you feel the difference? There's belonging, and everybody kind of nods, and you do your thing and belonging. And then there's that belonging where, wow, you have those moments with somebody, and you know that they hear you and you hear them, and there's a deeper connection. And we can feel the difference. So that's the celebration this morning. I'd like to read a poem that feels for me like the story of the eunuch. I want to read, this is a long poem and I'm not going to read the whole thing, just little parts, but I want to read the last part first and then I'll read it again because it's the most compelling. So this is Mary Oliver, West Wind. I picked this up because it's been windy. And spring tends to come in windiness. But there's this part that says, listen, are you breathing just a little and calling it a life? I love that line. Are you breathing just a little and calling it a life? While the soul, after all, is only a window, and the opening of the window is no more difficult than waking from a little sleep. I love that. So I'm going to read that again in a moment. But let me read a little bit of the rest of the poem. And again, this is in honor of the eunuch who, in my mind, reached out for another life. That's our invitation this morning, I think. He said, the poem by Mary Oliver says, "Who can open the door who does not reach for the latch? Who can travel the miles who does not put one foot in front of the other? All attentive to what presents itself continually. Who will behold the inner chamber, who has not observed with admiration, even with rapture, the outer stone? Well, there is time left. Fields everywhere invite you into them. And who will care? Who will chide you if you wander away from wherever you are and look for your soul? Quickly then, get up, put on your coat, leave your desk." Before I read this line again, I just want to pause prayerfully and invite you into prayer with me for Olir and Free, the boys in Uganda. We are in the process of getting things in line for Robert or perhaps his wife to go to Uganda. Some of the difficulty that's going on is that we don't have a death certificate for their father. We have one for their mother because it was a known gunman, and it's all documented. But when you are in a country that is at war, where there's so much unrest, people die all the time without death certificates. But when we went to a lawyer here, he can't adopt his nephews without the correct documents. So we're trying to arrange a trip, which is going to happen, where perhaps Helen will go and secure correct documents in a country that does understand. And then the plan is to bring those documents back and then do the work here to make it a smooth entry, and then go get them. So if you as a congregation would just, when you're in moments of prayer, just remember these boys. I feel pretty certain that they're going to be with us before too long, and yet it is a road. So as we close with this poem, we'll just kind of hold them in their life in prayer. Listen, are you breathing just a little and calling it a life? Well, the soul, after all, is only a window, and the opening of the window is no more difficult than the wakening from a little sleep. Thank you for walking into this passage with me this morning. If you would stand with me, and I need to find out what the page number is. 358. 358.